There we go.
That's for sure.
How's that look?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Well, I want to welcome everybody again to this webinar. It's about putting community in the community solar. And it's very encouraging to see so many people interested in the subject and take some time out of your private lives to do this. I can't tell you how much that means to us. So my name is Glen Brand. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy for Solar United Neighbors. And I'm based in New York City. And you have been talking at the beginning here with Annie Wolf, our Director of Outreach and Membership. And tonight, what we're going to do is talk about what community solar is and why it's important, and how you might want to get engaged in a community solar project or what the avenues are to do so, and then take some Q&A. In particular, I want to try to define and distinguish what we would regard as true community solar, as opposed to a lot of programs out there that claim to be or use the term community solar, but they don't really make they don't really fulfill our definition of the goals and the objectives of community solar. So we'll be talking about that quite a bit, because I think there's a lot of confusion out there. They see the local utility talking about community solar, and they're not really community solar in many cases. So we'll get into that. The first thing I want to say is that we've put together a community solar guide. Oops, sorry about the misspelling on resources. And a lot these resources are available on our website, so you can go there to solarunitedneighbors.org, and under the drop down menu of Learn the Issues, then you go to Community Solar, and you can find our Community Solar guide that has a lot of the information that I'll be going over today, and a lot of other resources which I'll mention at the end. So the first key question is, what is community solar? And then why it matters, why it's important. And there are a number of elements of why it is essential, really, if we're going to really move to a clean energy future. So here's a useful definition. Oops, sorry about that. So community solar is when individuals, businesses, organizations, nonprofits, but they can be for-profit businesses, for example, come together and invest in a nearby solar installation and open up the project to folks to buy a share. In some ways, you might want to think of it as a sort of a condominium, where people buy a condominium share. It's not exactly like that, but you can conceive of it that way. The key thing here is that the solar installation produces the power, and you would receive, if you're an investor or a participant or shareholder, a credit on your bill each month for the energy produced by that share. So it's pretty simple. It really depends upon a credit system, which is very similar to net metering. And if you're a rooftop solar homeowner, or you know a lot about solar policy, that's really the rock foundation of rooftop solar. So it's very, very similar, right? You get a bill credit. That sounds simple, but the problem is that your utility must participate in a community solar program. And not every state has one. And this is a challenge, and we're working on opening it up more states, and we can talk about in the Q&A in a moment. And so right now, 20 states have some form of community shared or community solar policy in place. Usually this is in the form of state enabling legislation, but the landscape is varied depending on where you are in the country. Sometimes it's available statewide, sometimes it's available only in certain utility territories, sometimes through your rural electric cooperative, or in some cases, there's some good programs with municipal utilities. And here's a list if you're curious about what the states are. And I'm pretty sure, I got this from the web, from a group called Solstice, but it was the handiest, easiest to understand map. The orange color is where we have what I'm calling statewide community solar legislation. So you'll see it's a large part of the East and West Coast. New Mexico is just joined this list last year with a good community solar program. And you can see Minnesota has a very famous program, one of the first. Colorado is the first. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. And I'll just point out right now that there are bills in the Ohio and Pennsylvania legislatures right now that would enable community solar. And we're working to move those bills forward. Now, the blue states here have at least one independent project online. And so this is where it is what I was talking about varied. There are a lot of restrictions if you live in one of those states. It depends upon the rules that are operating in your state. And again, most of these are utility-based programs. And let's see. Virginia, there's some talk about getting community solar going, but there's no bill right now. And I think that's really the state of play right now.
We did have a question come in that's super relevant, so I don't want to wait until the end.
Yeah,
But
please.
Marcia asks, why does community solar even require legislation?
Yeah. Yeah, well, you could ask that questions about a lot of our energy policies. You know, I think I don't think it's a cynical answer. I think it's a real answer. I think, you know, what dominates energy policies and clean energy policies are the big monopoly utilities around the country. And for the same reasons that many, if not most, of the large monopoly utilities oppose rooftop solar, they oppose community solar. And so they easily see it as a threat to their business model. You know, and basically they want to own all of the power or the transmission, depending on where you live. And these programs challenge that model. Now, having said that, there are a lot of utilities who are truly interested. And I think we can look to some municipal programs, municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives who understand that this is going to be part of the services they're going to need to provide. I don't know if that's a really satisfying answer to your question, but it's really a political problem that's embedded in our larger energy system. And I think there were probably good reasons for it when we started building our transmission systems and energy systems in the turn of the century and into the early part of the 20th century. And now it is clearly an outmoded system, but that is what we're dealing with still. All right. So, I wonder how I move that. There we go. Trying to move that out of the way. So why does community solar matter? And the truth is that while there are more than 2 million people in the US or households that have gone solar, right? They've installed rooftop solar in their homes and businesses. The fact is millions of people cannot, and they want to, go solar because their buildings are either not suitable, they have a lot of trees, or their roofs are not suitable, they don't have the property for other kinds of systems. A lot of people can't afford the upfront cost despite solar getting so much cheaper in the last 5, 10, 20 years, of course, been quite amazing. Or the true reality is a lot of people live and work in rental properties. And so how are you going to go solar if you can't, if you don't own your building? And so that's where community solar comes in. By one account, this is from a federal study, nearly half of all US households and businesses are unable to host solar systems. So it is absolutely essential that community solar programs become widely available so more people can enjoy the benefits of going solar and become solar owners. And solar ownership is a key part of what we think it matters with community solar and solar in general. The other part of why community solar is so important is it is a key way to broaden solar access to low and middle income households. It is the way to lower upfront costs. Not everyone, of course, who lives in a rental property is low and middle income, but many, many people are. And so if we can't offer solar in a reasonable and a reasonable and affordable way through just solar ownership for individual systems, then community solar is going to have to fill that gap. And we'll talk about the specific policies to talk about broadening solar access and more equitable access. So as I mentioned in the beginning here, there's sort of community solar and then what I would regard as community solar with scare quotes. And the fact is, as I mentioned, our energy system is a hodgepodge, a patchwork of all kinds of overlapping systems. And so depending on where you live, the design and type of the community solar program will be very different. In many places, in fact, probably most of the country, only utilities or large commercial solar developers can build solar projects. And that's because they have not gone through the enabling legislation, which opens up the market to everybody. I think a very common thing, and I'm sure you all have probably noticed it, is that many of the large monopoly utilities are calling their large scale solar projects as community projects. And we'll talk about the principles that where it's clear that these are not. Now, that doesn't mean these programs don't have some benefits in some cases, but we would not regard them as community solar, and you'll see why. Okay, so how do you distinguish a community solar project that really serves the community, at least in our view, as opposed to what we might call a fake or faux community solar program? So here, I think, are some of the key points. People go solar for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons for sure is that they want predictable, reliable, verifiable electricity savings. They want to lower their energy costs. And if a community solar project doesn't do that, then it's not really worthy of the name. It's not serving the community. We think ownership is a key part of this, right? You should be able to own a part of the solar project and become an investor. That means also you should be able to transfer or sell your share, right? You shouldn't be stuck with it. If you move, you should be able to just sell that share or transfer it to another location. There should be a transparent process. It should be easy as possible to subscribe to a project, to unsubscribe, or to transfer your share. This is really important because it's confusing in many cases where there's a lot of fine print, and there are some clear consumer-friendly processes that need to happen for people to feel confident about their investment. And then as a part of that, things do change sometimes, right? The solar project is a living thing, so to speak, and it needs to be maintained. And sometimes there's additional cost, like anything else in this world. And so subscribers should really learn what's going on. What are the maintenance costs? What are the other costs that they might incur? Now, we define community solar as serving the local community, right? Otherwise, what does the word community mean? It in part means local. And so we think it's important that there be a clear connection to a specific solar project, or it could be a group of projects in nearby. The solar has to be close to where you consume it. Otherwise, you're talking about a utility scale project, which, while cleaner than a coal plant far away, is still not giving the kind of local benefits that we would regard as essential. You should know, if you invest in a community solar project, you should know exactly where that solar array is, or solar arrays, and where your power is coming from, or at least it's where it's going into the grid. There's a lot of controversy about large scale solar projects in the country. As with any development project, they can be controversial. And we think it's important that community solar projects be sited responsibly. Every development will have some impacts, but it should minimize those impacts and support the community's goals. We developed a separate document, which is available on our community solar page, which lays out what we think are some of the responsible siting principles. And I won't really get into that here, but this is not something that should be ignored. It's very important if we're going to build the kind of solar that we need. And then local benefits would include local job creation and strengthening the grid. It should not be a burden to the grid. It actually should be strengthening that grid, making it more viable, more reliable, more safe. And there are lots of different ways to do that. I mentioned expanding solar access, and so we can't do that and just rely on it to happen by itself. That's not really realistic. So we think a good community solar program should ensure and incentivize low and middle income participation. And there's a lot of ways to do that. You can have short contract term lengths. You could have minimal or no cancellation fees. You can allow residents of apartment buildings, multi-unit buildings, to subscribe. And a lot of times they can't because there are all these different meters, or there's a 1 meter. And so that is a key part of it. The second bullet here says at least 10 states have low income provisions in their community solar programs. And by that, I mean they have very specific goals or incentives or sometimes mandates that require a certain percentage of the projects or subscribers of those projects be low and middle income families. And I'll talk about an example of that a little later. The other part about community solar, and this goes back to what I was saying about monopoly utilities, is there should be a competitive market for community solar. It should not be owned. This is the third bullet, but I should have made it the first. Utilities should not be able to monopolize these programs. They should compete in a fair playing field, but they should not be given special access to run all of these programs. That's bad. Competition is generally very good for consumers, as we all know, and that is especially the case with energy markets. That means in reality is that private third parties, and this could be anyone, it could be an individual, it could be a group of individuals, a nonprofit, a church, small businesses, could be a large business. It could be a Walmart, whatever. But they should be able to develop their own projects. Doesn't mean excluding utilities. They should be competing as well. So we think that's a critically important part of the program. And I would say most utility run programs benefit from monopoly and lack of competition. Now, if you don't have an option to go for a utility solar program, or you're looking to compare a community solar program run by your utility with a privately developed ones, we've come up with a series of questions. There's 2 slides here that you really should ask, right, to determine whether it's a true community solar program, again, in our opinion. So, as I said, is the process clear? Are the terms clear? Are the upfront and ongoing costs identified? And here, the third one is really important. Is there a premium charge to run the program above the standard cost of electricity? So in most of these utility run programs, and again, there are some that are much better than others, but in a lot of them, basically, they are just charging extra money to for the solar power from a utility scale project far from where you're consuming the energy. And so we don't want to know what that premium is and what they're supposedly using that money for. We want to make it clear what the term of the subscription is. And again, is it portable? Is it transferable? Is it sellable? Very important. And a few more questions. Some utility communities, so-called community solar programs are restricted in who can participate. So they'll stop at a county line or utility territory line. And you should know that, because otherwise, how could it be open to the whole community? Does the program ensure low and middle income residents participation? And do those savings, are they meaningful? And of course, we could talk about what meaningful is, but we would want to find out what it is. If it's $50 a year, you're saving electric costs, it's not clear that it's worth it, right? And then again, is there competition? And then finally, is the subscription tied to a solar array that exists in the real world, or a generic solar resource, or is it a faraway utility scale? You should know where your solar is. Excuse me. So let's talk about some of the state community solar programs, and then we'll talk about other forms. Colorado was the first state to pass this legislation. I believe it was in 2010. And a lot of the state programs really followed in the wake of Colorado's and used their model. They've defined them to be from 10 kilowatts to 20 megawatts. Now, 20 megawatts is really big. A lot of people could get their power from such. But they've capped the size, right, to exclude super giant utility scale projects. It should be located in or near the same communities the customer is being served. So that fulfills one of our principles. Has third party competition. And subscribers will receive full retail credit for the portion of the power that's produced, minus some reasonable charge to cover utility costs to deliver the electricity to the customers. Yeah, so certainly some of those expenses are legitimate. And then, like net metering, the bill credit can be carried forward if it exceeds the customer's electricity use in any given billing period. So that really is a solid foundation for a state program. Now, I could have, I mentioned there's 20 programs around the country, but I want to highlight not only Colorado's because it was first and it's a solid one, but New Jersey's program, which is just a couple of years old. It has one of the strongest equity provisions in the U.S. It sets aside 40% of the overall program's capacity to serve low and middle income customers. So New Jersey has made it a goal of the program to get as many people access to solar ownership and solar use. It's a pilot project. It's really, right now, it's only authorized from 2019 through this year. It's certainly going to be renewed, almost certainly. And it is setting up a 75 megawatts for each year for these first 3 years, and that translates 45,000 residents. So it's a significant program. And I would also want to say that New Mexico has a very similar equity provision. Now, a lot of community solar projects, though, are done by people like you. And I just want to give some examples so you can conceive of it. And here are 3 real life ones. These are not made up. These are real people and real projects. But for example, John Mariani developed a 10 kilowatt array on the roof of an apartment building that he owns in a neighborhood in Baltimore. And through virtual net metering, the project powers his home, his sisters, and also the rental building meter. So it is a very small, very limited number of subscribers, but he develops himself because Maryland has a good pilot project for community solar. Here's one in New Jersey, Alan Spector and a bunch of his neighbors in this particular township, New Jersey. They worked with their electricity cooperative so that they could build and operate a 50 kilowatt array. They call it the Sussex Solar Garden. So you can Google that and see some cool stuff with that. And that has 18 member owners who have invested in that system and who share the production of that system. And then this final one is one in Vermont. It's a 150 kilowatt system. And it was done as a collective based on this particular landowner who is sort of the anchor tenant, and a lot of people have come together for that. So there's no reason why a community solar project could not be developed by individuals. It just doesn't have to be big players. Now, having said that, it's really important that if you live in an area with a rural electric cooperative, to know that a lot of rural electric cooperatives who are already based on kind of the cooperative member owner model, provide some really good programs. Not every electric cooperative does, but if you have an electric cooperative, you get your power from one, you can talk to them about these programs and ask them to do something similar. And I won't go through the details here, but you see they're very specific. And the one I like this one in Wisconsin, for example, because it defines what the costs are up front and what your payback's going to be. And that's a really good thing to know if you're getting involved in this. There are a bunch of city-owned, that is municipally owned municipal cities. If you live in a place with a municipal utility, you should not be excluded from a community solar program. And so we like the Orlando Municipal Utilities Community Solar Program. There's a lock-in rate, 13 cents a kilowatts for 25 years. That's the kind of predictability that you can make sound decisions about. And we cite that often as a one that's a pretty good program. Now, I wanted to tell you that this is just an introduction to the subject, and of course, we'll talk about this in some of the Q&A, but I wanted to just send you to our website first, so that's solarunitedneighbors.org. You go to Community Solar and learn the issues, and there's a lot more information here on the specifics. You want to look to the guide to community solar, and we'll be sending out a link to that tomorrow to everybody. And a lot of the information that I just went over really comes from that guide. I mentioned the community solar siting guidelines. If you're concerned, as we are, about responsible siting of these projects, you want to take a look at that. And then if you want to find a community solar project near you, we have a pilot project on our website where you can look up the various community solar options in 3 or 4 states. And so we're just rolling that out. That includes Colorado, Maryland, and I can't remember the one other state as well. And then we did a deep dive into the community solar program in Maryland. We helped support and get that going in Maryland. And we've sort of have a lessons learned and future directions for the program report on there if you really want to get more wonky into the subject. I do want to mention 2 other things. Our partners, the Institute for Self-Reliance, has a great community solar program tracker. You can just Google that and it'll come up and it gives you the information to compare various states. And then there are many of these, but again, none of our partners, Vote Solar, has a good low income solar policy guide if you're interested in how those programs work or should work. So that is a quick run through, I think. I hope I didn't talk too fast about community solar and why we think it's such an important part of the solution. And so with that, I'll stop and we can take some questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Glenn. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so people can see?
I did.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. So we've had lots of questions coming in, which is fantastic. But I do want to, so Marie was one of the first ones to ask, and she was interested in the definition of community solar and whether or not we worked with TES thermal storage. I hope we address the definition of community solar, but that other side of it, working with the TES thermal storage. I don't know how much you're familiar with that, Glenn.
Yeah, I'm not actually.
Okay.
Cool. I wouldn't be able to say anything intelligent about
definitely.
that. I do want to address Aaron Green's question. He wrote, are more states besides New York considered a stacked or consolidated bill with CS community solar credits rather than non-consolidated 2 bills? Yeah, so every program should have a consolidated bill. That is just a basic thing. And most of the newer programs have consolidated bills. That's just an essential part of that. Gotcha. Let's see. I'll just take this one too. My utility, this is from Ramsey. My utility is Southern California Edison, but my electricity is from Clean Power Alliance. I thought they were community solar. Now listening to you, I'm thinking they are not. Aha. So you need to ask them those questions that I posed and see what the answers are. I mean, it's really, it's consumer beware, right? So you're right. You should do your due diligence on this. I don't know who this is, and this could be a very good program for all I know. I don't want to cast aspersions. I don't know. But The questions that are in our guide, the ones that I mentioned, and they're slightly more elaborate than that in the guide, you should be asking them directly to see what those answers are.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so into the top. We have a couple of questions about California and Florida, and so I'm going to save those for the end because we could talk about them all evening. So I want to hit the community solar questions first, but Benjamin and a few others are asking about that. This one comes from Tom. Electrification is a benefit to the utility. Could they be encouraged to make community solar available to EV customers or heat pump customers for a climate preservation reason?
Well, there's no reason why. I mean, what we're aiming for is a program that is not just about solar, right? Because the new energy system is not just about solar. That's a key essential part of it. But we're looking at battery storage. We're looking at integration of electric vehicles and cool things like, having the power go back, a two-way grid, so you can send power from your electric vehicle at certain times, or from your battery that's charged by your solar array, back to the grid during peak hours where the electricity is expensive and there are other issues. The same thing should be true for community solar, right? We should be thinking about community solar assets as one that benefits the grid and everybody, not just the people who subscribe to it. So that's a goal here. Now, to my knowledge, I don't know that any of the community solar programs are doing that. There's a lot of talk about it, in part because we're all talking about it, right? So we need to be advocating that we're looking at the value of all so-called distributed, that's what we're talking about, rooftop and community solar, distributed solar, as opposed to big concentrated plants that are maybe replacing big, gas power plants or whatnot. So to my knowledge, I don't know if there is that, but that is certainly what we've been advocating for. We should have solar owners, whether they own the whole project on their own rooftop or owners in a community solar project, should be able to participate and benefit in the full suite of services in a modern two-way grid.
Gotcha. Thanks, Glenn. This question comes from Scott. So does quote unquote community solar legislation also allow wind turbines and other renewable energy sources to connect to local utilities?
I don't know that. The community solar projects we work on are enabling legislation almost always restricts it. There may be exceptions. I haven't paid much attention to them, to be honest. But they're really about community solar alone. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't have a community solar turbine system. But I don't know about this, to tell you the truth. I mean, the same thing should apply, it would seem to me, as long as it's responsibly sited and so forth.
Yeah. And from my experience, be it like with community solar, the company that I had gone with did have options for wind as well as other renewable sources, but they weren't a great project.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that those would be large utility scale projects. So defining what a community wind project, we'd have to be rigorous about that.
Sure, definitely. This comes from Aaron. Are more states besides New York considering a stacked consolidated flow of CS credits rather than non-consolidated?
Yeah, I had answered that earlier.
Yeah. Sorry.
So yes, most programs, any modern program, all the programs are going to have that now. The first couple did not.
Okay, cool.
But Colorado does.
Yay, Colorado. This one's specific to Virginia. So I told Jim that I would have our VA team follow up with him if you're not sure, but about the Virginia utility companies required to follow the maximum production for residential net metering of 25 kilowatts. That's a very specific question.
Yeah. I can't speak to that specifically, but I think that is true. Part of the problem is we have no community solar enabling legislation, as they say, in Virginia, right? So there are a fake program, in my view, that Dominion offers, only Dominion territory. Virginia really does need, and there's some talk in the legislature to get a community solar bill. And as I mentioned, Pennsylvania is on the verge of it. Could happen this session. And I think I'm increasingly getting confident there'll be the enabling legislation in Ohio. So it is growing. And of course, the early programs are learning from, the later programs are learning a lot from the early programs. I see an interesting question about Cincinnati.
Yeah.
I don't believe, and I know that there's a council member on the call, or was, from Cincinnati. Um, Cincinnati, I'm almost positive, does not have a municipally owned utility, and instead gets their power from the big utility in Duke or whatever, whoever owns it now. And so Ohio does not have any community solar at all right now. That's why we're working to pass it. Now, the government of Cincinnati, I know just because I used to live in Cincinnati 25 years ago, so I have some old friends there. I know the government of Cincinnati invested in their own community solar project on a landfill. It was one of the biggest community solar projects of the kind in the country, but that's powering, which is a great thing. It's powering municipal operations. That's not the same thing as a community solar project. Now, you could imagine that a project like that could have the city operations as an anchor tenant, so to speak, and then open it up to community members. And that would be a great idea. And I know there's a lot of talk about programs like that. Yes, that's right, Kimberly.
Okay, cool. Let's see. So, and Jim, I will have our Virginia team follow up with you too about that specific Virginia question, because I want to make sure that gets addressed.
I want to respond to Eugene's question about what carrot or stick does New Jersey possess to enforce that 40%. So that's a really good question. So in New Jersey's program, you have to present evidence, right, that the program is going to do what it's supposed to. In the case, well, I think I said it was every project has to have 40% LMI subscriptions. And so you have to show that in order to get a permit to connect the project. So that is the stick. I don't know what the carrot is, to tell you the truth. The law is, it's a mandate, that law. Now, one could imagine some programs having carrots where they could give incentives for projects that serve more LMI consumers. They could do this through, facilitated permitting. They could do a lower cost permitting. They could do those kinds of things. They could connect with a bank for financing. One could imagine all kinds of nice things, but I'm not aware of it. But that's the stick, if you want to call it a stick, is you have to go through the program to get permission.
Definitely. And then Marcia's asked us to define LMI. I'm not sure if you're looking for a specific income range that we're talking about, but low and middle income.
Yeah, so that's all over the place. Usually it's a percentage of the poverty rate, which is established by the federal government. Sometimes it's something like 80%, 50%, that kind of thing. There are some best practices there about what's regarded as low and middle income. And it's important, of course, that those be defined and not just be grouped together as it often is, as I've been doing with a phrase like LMI. So those have to be defined, and they are defined. But I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I could certainly look them up and get them to you. But you're right to ask that question, because we want to make sure that those programs actually benefit the people who have been excluded from the programs. And this is actually a really important issue, because it's a matter of fairness. The only federal incentive for rooftop solar, as most of you probably know, is the Solar Investment Tax Credit, or the ITC. And that is only benefited people who have a tax bill. You don't get a credit unless you have a tax bill. So if you don't, if you don't make enough money to have a tax bill, then you can't benefit from the ITC. So there's been hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars have benefited people to help them go solar, which we think is great, and that should happen. But it's not fair, for example, that they were lower income people were excluded from that benefit. And there's a policy now in the Build Back Better bill that would address that by just making a direct pay kind of thing and not depend on the tax credit. And I bring this up not as an aside, really, but to show that everyone should be benefiting from policies that help folks go solar.
Mm-hmm. And piggybacking on that, actually, Jim asked, does the federal government support or promote community solar?
So not a whole lot. There is, as a part of the Build Back Better plan, which is frankly sort of dead right now, but there's efforts to resuscitate the clean energy parts of this. And there's almost certainly going to be an effort, and I'm feeling fairly optimistic that it'll come up this spring. That will take things like renewal of the investment tax credit, a host of things, funding of programs like the Rural Energy for America program, which supports rural businesses going solar. There's a whole lot of good stuff in there for rooftop. For community solar, there's a great provision which would require every single state, or every single utility in every state to offer a community solar program. And this would really advance community solar. Now, whether that gets through, there's a separate bill on that too right now. Whether that gets through the Congress is anyone's guess. We certainly support that. Of course, the devil's in the details there. We got to make sure that the community solar is, at least from our perspective, is true community solar.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we can, I'm hoping for it, but I don't think we can wait for the federal government. It's time to, we're not going to wait. We're going to get it passed in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and we're going to get it going in Virginia. And we're going to get it going in other states. And if the feds come and help, that'd be great too.
Wouldn't it be nice? So a couple of questions came in with the Q&A as well. Jimmy asked, as an investor in a community solar project, would the investor be eligible to get a federal tax deduction?
You should be, you should be able to get the ITC, but nothing special beyond that.
Gotcha.
So the investment tax credit had been at 30% of the project cost. If you're putting a rooftop system on your property, that has now started to step down, and is going, unless Congress takes action, that'll be stepped down to 0 by the end of this year. And in the bill now is a continuation of the investment tax credit at 30% for at least 5 more years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, wait, I should just make one thing. Some states have additional incentives like that, but not too many of them.
Okay. And Tad asked whether Sun has worked on any community solar projects in DC, which I'm not aware of. But
well, we really, some of you may know that Solar United Neighbors really got its start in Washington, DC. So we've long been engaged in the local policy there. And we were among the leaders on the fight to get community solar enabled in DC. And so they have a really good program. I'm not quite sure what to say other than we help set up the policy. We advocate people use the program, but we have not sort of directly participated in a specific project, which I think is the intent of the question.
I think that was the question. Yeah. And then Elizabeth asks, if I'm understanding correctly, whether a person owns solar panels on their roof or not, they nonetheless, under community solar communities, benefit and support clean energy.
I'm sorry, you went out there, Annie. I didn't hear that.
Sorry. So if so whether a person owns solar panels on their roof or not, they, under community solar, regulations and being a part of it, they're benefiting and supporting clean energy, right? Whether or not.
Yes. Generally speaking, yes. Absolutely. Yeah. Someone's corrected me. It's zeroing out in 2023 is the zeroing out. Yes. Of the solar investment tax credit. That's the federal one. And again, that has not too much to do with community solar right now. An interesting question about I think your question, Eugene, is there any REC? And I think you're referring to rural electric cooperatives with REC. I hope that's what you meant. Yeah, thank you for, there it is, zeros out in 2024. Yeah, thank you. So yes, I mentioned the the one in the Keys earlier. We have a fact sheet on rural electric cooperatives that mentions a couple of community solar programs that are run by electric cooperatives. So you really have to approach your cooperative. And I have to say, we're big fans of the electric cooperative movement. You know, they have sort of a built-in process for democracy that we don't really have in other systems. So it's really important, if you're a owner of a rural electric cooperative, to go to your board and say, we want to have a community solar project. We need a program set up, and here are a few good models out there, and let's get it going, because they have the power to do things independently um, than a lot of other utilities. And the same thing is true of municipal utilities. Often they can do things faster. Trying to get the state to adopt a statewide model is, of course, a bigger lift.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you for posting that, Annie.
Of course.
I want to repeat what Ron just said. Solar on roofs benefits all ratepayers, whether it's on the roof or not. Absolutely true. And we have one of my favorite subjects.
Yeah. Question that relates, so we've had a few questions about sort of how California and Florida are affecting net metering, which is not necessarily, well, actually, that's part of the question is, does net metering affect community solar, and sort of what, how we're handling some of the situations in California and Florida. So I do want to definitely.
Yeah, so as if you've been paying attention to these controversies, there are attacks by monopoly utilities, in this case, Florida Power and Light and PG&E in California. They want to either reduce the rate of net metering compensation. That's the amount that the amount that you would get when you send your excess power to the grid, to your neighbors. They want to either get that to avoided cost, or they want to phase out net metering altogether. So this has been highly controversial. We are in kind of a knife fight, to tell you the truth, in Florida to try to stop this. We've been supporting our partners in California as well. And in Florida's case, there is no statewide community solar program. Now, FP&L, of course, has their, what I would regard as a rather weak, fake community solar program that they bill as a community solar program. But that's not the same, as I've been saying quite a few times. The issue with the connection with net metering and community solar really has to do with the so-called virtual net meter. So when you have a project that serves multiple meters, as a community solar does, or at least through a bill credit system, you need some form of virtual net metering. So it's not clear what's going to happen. Now, one could imagine that they would have to reestablish that kind of net metering credit system when they enable, eventually they will do a community solar project program in Florida. I'm confident of that. So that remains to be seen. So right now we are heavily involved in if you're in Florida, you know all about it, and you know how much our folks have been working with our partners there to defend net metering. And in California, we have a cautiously, I would regard it as a not a complete victory, but that has been slowed down and delayed somewhat indefinitely. And we'll see what happens there. So yes, there is a threat here. If you get rid of net metering, what happens to the community solar virtual net metering system? And that has to be addressed state by state.
And actually, along that, Ron mentioned that we've also got a net metering attack in New York. So a total of 8 states are having these issues.
Yeah, and it's not just the states, by the way. We just the other day we can see that there's a small rural electric cooperative, big territory, but not that many people, in Colorado. They're talking about weakening or eliminating net metering. This is a thread that's going on throughout the United States right now. I would say, in case people get depressed about this, which is understandable, I would say that you may recall about 5 years ago, there was a threat in Florida to get rid of net metering. There was a big ballot initiative that went down in flames. We won there. In Nevada, they were successful. Our opponents were successful in getting rid of net metering. That was such a disaster that they had to reinstate, the state of Nevada reinstated net metering. So we could be seeing a new effort that will last, these attacks on net metering, but it also could be true that what happened in Nevada is really what's going to happen in Florida, California, should the utilities prevail. So I think it's good to know the history here a little.
Sure. That is for sure. Let's see. Um, Jim asks why utilities and just overall individual consumption is being disincentivized, because one of the attractions of solar is abundance. So
Yeah, so that gets to the root problem here, right? So, I mean, the quickest way I can explain this, and it's common sense, is if utilities have a business model in which they make their money by either transmission of power. So it's state to state. Some can't do transmission, some can't do generation. But I'll just generalize here. If you make your money by the amount of electricity you sell, you have an incentive to sell a lot of electricity, and you have a disincentive to allow so-called competitors, right? You don't want people to use less electricity. And of course, one of the main attractions to uh, distributed solar, like community and rooftop, is you're lowering your bill because you're using less electricity that has to be pumped and transmitted from a big power plant into your home. Now, we're not anti-grid, right? I mean, the grid is an important thing, and we need the grid. That's the basis of net metering, and it helps strengthen everybody, as everyone's pointed out, when you have good and widespread use of distributed solar. So we have a problem here, and the only way to really address it is to fix these misaligned incentives. And so there are a lot of slick policy ideas to do this. Some are called performance-based standards, in which you really reward utilities for helping people go solar. For example, you can imagine a completely different regulatory regime. Hawaii is a leader in that, for example. Um, uh, but basically, the smarter utilities understand that they are going to become more like the internet, so to speak, in which they're providing sort of all kinds of services rather than simply making their money selling power. The other ways they make money, monopoly utilities in particular make their money because they are able to rate base uh, things, and they have an incentive. So they love to build new power plants, and they do this because they're getting paid for that by all of you, by ratepayers. And they like expensive stuff like that because they're guaranteed a rate of return, 8% up to 12%. What other kind of business in the United States has a guaranteed rate of return of 8 to 12%? Not that they don't get that, but they have it guaranteed. So, that's another issue, right? And then, of course, there's the larger thornier political questions about the political influence of monopoly utilities, right? Who invest your money, ratepayer money, often, as in the Ohio scandal recently, in basically, in that case, was bribing people to get favorable policy. They give campaign donations to, this is not a partisan thing, they give it to everybody, Democrats and Republicans. And so their power needs to be reined in. And that just complicates this what I'm calling misaligned incentives problem. So I hope that wasn't too much of a lecture, but I think that's the way to look at the problem, to make sense of it.
This is an interesting question from Penny, and I want to know too. So she's on staff of a nonprofit in Wyoming that was pursuing getting a community solar project in their community. So they were working with the utility, which wasn't a co-op, about tying into the grid. But before going very far, the utility decided they were considering installing a community solar array on their buildings. So are the questions that they should be asking the same ones that you talked about, or is there a different set of questions that they should be?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the distinction here. This is an interesting question. It sounded like are they doing this instead of? I'm not sure I understand the
Penny,
question.
I'm going to allow you to talk.
Yeah, that's a cool question, Penny.
Yeah. So Penny, you should be able to unmute yourself. There we go. Perfect.
Yes, it would be actually instead of. What we were trying to figure out is what would work in our community. It's a small community.
Yeah.
And then and we were having, good conversations with the utility company. And then they decided, because they have large buildings in our community, that they would install this on their rooftops. But it's my understanding that it would then be their project. They would allow subscribers from the community, but
Well, it
be
could be
different.
yeah.
I don't know.
So, I mean, there's no reason why they shouldn't. I mean, that's great that this utility wants to do this if indeed they're opening up to subscribers and it fulfills, answers those questions or fulfills the principles that laid it out. And by the way, we all acknowledge that not everyone's going to agree with our principles, right? But we're not embarrassed about articulating them either. We think it's actually the way to go. So it sounds like this could be a win-win, right? I don't want to be too rosy-eyed about it, but it sounds like you could pursue this and making sure that the terms of it meet what we regard as true community solar. So I don't think it's given up. If they want to host it on their buildings, great.
Right.
That's wonderful. So potentially this could be a really good thing. Now,
Right.
I'm also, as you could all tell, a little skeptical of the utilities' motives, but it could very well be this could be a good project.
Thank you.
So we have one, I'm going to do one last question. We have a ton of questions, and I'll try to do some follow up in our email tomorrow, and definitely get those who have very state specific questions, follow up answers from our state teams.
Yeah.
But Ron asks about a pending FERC case on utility contributions, sometimes confused with lobbying. Do you have how about that
Yes.
one?
Yeah, well, we're a part of that. We're one of the parties to this. Just so acronyms here, FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. They're the ones that help regulate the federal energy system, such as it is. But remember, most energy policies in the United States are done by the states, but there's a clear role with the federal government, with the FERC, as they call it.
Oh, Glenn? He freeze for everyone. Oh, that's a bummer. Let's see if he comes back in a second. Otherwise, we will wrap things up and we'll get him to answer that question so I can. Oh, there you are.
Oh, I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened there. I guess my internet got wonky. I was just saying that we were part of that that petition to FERC, and we want them to establish rules that would prevent utilities from using your dollars, ratepayer dollars, for lobbying association dues. In this particular case, campaign donations a little more difficult because that runs into First Amendment, Citizens United and all of that stuff. New York State, by the way, has already passed a law saying ratepayers' money cannot be used to join lobbying associations like the Edison Electric Institute. We're working on that stuff in Ohio and in Arizona. So there is a definite movement to constrain what we would think is the undue influence of utilities on the political process.
Awesome. Well, it is 8:30 on the dot. Do you have one more question you want to answer?
I just saw James Cantor's question about why we see more solar in shopping centers. You would think that big grocery stores, which there are some who are doing it, and malls and all of this concrete would be parking lots would be ideal places for community solar projects. It would be great if they would step up and be the so-called host for these projects and then make them community solar projects. We would probably really have to build an incentive structure in the state policies to make that happen. But there are a lot of giant stores are going solar. Now they're usually doing it for not community solar purposes. they're doing it just to power and lower their own energy costs, which bravo. But it would be great if we could combine that with a true community solar project. And with that, I will say thank you very much. I can't tell you how much we appreciate you take the time to do this. And we'll be following up in the email. And I want to, I guess, just thank you for your interest.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. So a lot of you are asking about sort of interconnection challenges and questions and reliability and thermal and all of that. We actually are having a second webinar on community solar, which where those questions are the perfect questions for that. We're going to have our Go Solar team on, and they can answer all. I've kept notes of them, but definitely plan on joining us on March 9th for the second part of this. We actually were going to have these flip-flopped, but our Go Solar VP got called for grand jury duty, so we had to switch those around. But yeah, so anybody who has really technical questions, it's a great opportunity for our Go Solar session on March 9th. However, we will send the recording of this session, the slide deck, and then I'll also send the chat record because I know a couple of people asked for that tomorrow. And we really appreciate you being here and for taking the time to join us this evening. Have a wonderful rest of your day.